Hi, everybody. This is Jessie Azrillian at ACCE. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Education Attainment Division's bi-monthly webinar series. Our moderator, David Rattray, will provide a brief overview of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce's work in early childhood education and frame the issue from a business perspective, and he'll introduce our speakers. This is an hour-long webinar. There'll be a Q&A after both speakers have presented. And please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. There is a questions place in the chat box, and you can press send to all, and then we'll read them in the order that they were submitted during the last 15 to 20 minutes. So now I will introduce David Rattray. He's the president of Unite LA, which is the LA Chamber's foundation and education arm. David oversees the Chamber's education workforce development efforts and leads a staff of 25 with expertise ranging the cradle to career spectrum. So, David, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks, Jessie. And let me also just extend the same thanks Jessie gave to all of you for joining us today. We're honored and it's a pleasure to have this dialogue with you. I'll just set up a little bit of kind of the work that we've done and how we came into the work as mostly a warm-up to the two stars that are going to be excellent presenters, and I'll introduce them briefly as I wrap up. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that this is a space that was new to us about 6 or 7 years ago. As the LA Chamber started really developing its own work in education workforce development, most of the work was in high schools and college and workforce, and some work in elementary and middle, but modest, and little to no work in early childhood. And we thought that was the right thing to do for us, and it's what made sense and what felt comfortable. And we were approached 7, 8 years ago, or maybe even longer, I think it's 2005, 6, somewhere in there, by Rob Reiner, and he asked us to get engaged, and he made the case to us that we should be supporting universal pre-K in California and a significant tax initiative to underwrite that. And I want to say my first reaction is, no way, let's stay the heck away from that. But we then started learning about the Heckman curve and much of the literature around the efficacy of investing early and the strength of the payback for investing in children and infants and toddlers. And we started realizing that the achievement gap that we were fighting so hard to close and some of the dropout problems that we were fighting so hard to combat at a high school level were more effectively addressed in 0 to 5, from birth to 5, and that it was actually a lot cheaper to invest well then. So we became believers, and we did actually decide to become the first major business organization in California that supported a proposition that I referred to. The proposition failed, but we learned a big lesson, and mostly it was just being enlightened about the research that I think my colleagues will talk about in more detail. So that brought us into this arena, and since then we've done a number of things, including advocacy, a lot of what we would call systems work, and some programmatic work in the whole area of early childhood. On the policy side, we've sponsored a whole number of bills or supported bills to improve the quality of early childhood education in California. We've sponsored some bills to improve investments in transitional kindergarten and expansion of preschool and of other elements of infant and toddler care. And then we've supported a number of initiatives with a state superintendent and our governor to improve the system quality and system effectiveness at an administrative level and at an implementation level. On the system side, we developed something called the LA Compact, which initially was a broad-based effort to build a common agenda for our K-12 systems and our higher ed community and the larger community. and felt pretty good about that, and we're proud of ourselves, frankly, in developing the LA Compact and getting our mayor and our superintendent and the university presidents and many other partners signing off and working together. But we realized, again, we had left little kids behind, and about 2 or 3 years ago, we reached out to our largest regional body that supports infants and toddlers in preschool. It's called First 5 LA. And we asked them if they would join the LA Compact, and we would work with them to do a better job of aligning the systems and the programs and the provider community that support infants and toddlers and preschoolers to our K-12 system and the whole community. And one of the many projects that some of you may be familiar with or are involved in is a grade level reading initiative where we focus all of our partners in the 0 to 5 arena, in the pre-K or K to 3 arena, on getting to a better outcome around third grade reading potential and our proficiency. And another thing that came into the mix there is we learned about the misalignment of assessments, that the K-12 community used a more academic set of assessments to measure whether a child was kinder ready to enter kindergarten, whereas our early ed community tended to use assessments that were more social emotional, and that misalignment meant the two systems talked past each other in terms of what was working and how to measure it. So we're now committed to a process to get everybody in the County of Los Angeles to agree, both in the early childhood arena and the educational arena, to use a common assessment for kinder readiness and then use that to align our decisions and our resources and our curriculum. So that just gives you a little bit of a thumbnail of kind of some of the things that we've been drawn into, and I think we're just novices. You're going to hear from a couple of our partners that have found a voice for chambers in this arena that it can be really significant. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two colleagues, and I think we'll put their brief bios up, so I won't give a full introduction, but we'll start with Scott, and then we'll go to Mila. But so briefly, Scott is the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Greater Kansas Chamber of Commerce and has led their work in this area. So he's going to tell you about the Big 5 initiatives that I saw in publication. It was just blown away by the leadership and the success that he's going to share with you. And then Mila Calhoun, she's the General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Regional Development and Public Policy for the Birmingham Business Alliance, and is in that responsibility responsible for all policy work, which includes then this focus on early childhood, among other things. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I want to start by talking just a bit about the Big 5 and what it is and why we chose early childhood education as one of our Big 5 ideas. So as David said in the introduction, the Big 5 succinctly put are 5 big ideas to make Kansas City, greater Kansas City, both Kansas City, Missouri, and our Kansas side suburbs, the best place to live, work, start, and grow a business. And we asked a simple question. If you were CEO of the region, what would your priorities be? We had very little criteria in how you could answer this question, but you can see them there. Your answer had to be multi-year. It had to be regional. Couldn't be a statistical outcome, and it had to be a big idea. And to come to our Big 5, we had more than 30 no bad idea sessions. Go ahead. And we asked a group of community leaders, elected officials, young professionals, nonprofit philanthropic professionals, that question. If you were CEO of the region, what would your priorities be? We received 182 no bad idea ideas and took them from 182 to 20, and then from 20 to 5. And the 5 are, the original Big 5 ideas, I'll show you now here, are hosting the Global Symposium on Innovation in Animal Health, moving UMKC's world-class arts programs to a new downtown campus, growing our medical research from discovery to cure, making Kansas City America's most entrepreneurial city, and revitalizing our urban neighborhoods through the Urban Neighborhood Initiative. We launched those big 5 ideas 2.5 years ago, and you'll notice that kindergarten readiness and early childhood education is not one of the original 5. But about a year and a half ago, we accomplished the first of the 5 goals you see on that page. We now host the Global Symposium on Innovation in Animal Health. Kansas City is an international epicenter of animal health, and we are proud to boast what we consider to be the preeminent global symposium on the issue every August in Kansas City. So since we had checked one of the big 5 off the list, we went to our members and we said, what should we do? Should we keep the number at 5? Should we grow the number to more than 5? Should we just take the 5 down from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1? And what we heard from our membership was, add a new one, but only one new one at this time. Let's keep the big 5 to just 5 ideas. And so we did that. And you can go to the next slide. The new big 5 idea, as we call it around here, is building Kansas City's workforce of tomorrow through kindergarten readiness. And we went about designating this as a big 5 idea much the same way we did the original 5. We convened a stakeholder group and we asked them the same question. The answers we got in that meeting, it was just one meeting instead of 30 this time, were pretty interesting. There was a general consensus in the room at that time that education should be an area of focus for the big 5. But when you say education, as you all know, that can mean many things to many people. And we walked out of that meeting thinking, okay, we now have the expansive universe of education in which to work, but we knew we needed something more than just fixing education in Kansas City. We expected that our membership would do what it sounds like David and the LA Chamber did when they first got into the education space, which is direct us towards workforce development. You know, pre-technical classes for 16, 17, and 18-year-olds or post-secondary degree attainment. But what we actually heard was something different. As we began to meet with our executive committee and other business and philanthropic leaders in the community, they began to say to us the same thing that David alluded to, which is you can get the biggest bang for your buck if you get into early childhood education. So when we began our work, we started looking actually at third grade reading level attainment. That's an initiative of our mayors, the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, and we had heard some of the data around the impact of third grade reading proficiency on kids throughout lives. But when we got deeper into that issue, we learned by talking to our school district superintendents, and we host here at the KC Chamber a superintendent's forum, which is a collection of all of our region's school district superintendents. It happens every other month here in our offices. We presented the third grade reading idea to them, and they said to us, you know, third grade reading is terrific, and we would certainly love your help. However, if you really want to have an impact on the process, get to kids before they get to us. Get them ready for kindergarten. So go ahead to the next slide. That's what we did, kindergarten readiness. And we did it first by naming 3 community leaders who would lead our effort. And they are 2 former mayors, one the former mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, the other the former mayor of Kansas City, Kansas, but both of whom have education backgrounds and lended instant credibility both from their political experience but also their well-known reputations as educators, both current and former. And then we also brought in someone from one of our community's largest and most charitable foundations. Tracy McFerrin is the vice president of the Hall Family Foundation, and she oversees all of their educational gift-making. Go ahead to the next slide. We identified quickly the problem. And many of you have probably seen this if you work in the early childhood education space. So I'm preaching to the converted a little bit here, and I won't spend much time on it. But the interesting thing to us was and remains the jaw-dropping impact of the data around this particular issue. I spoke to a group last week of business leaders, and for folks who aren't familiar with Professor Heckman's data or his research or some of the other data that's out there, and the 2 that I would refer everyone to if you haven't read them are the Perry Highscope study through 40 years and a report called The Early Catastrophe, which was actually done in part by some researchers at the University of Kansas. All of that data shows what you all probably know, which is that early childhood education is where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Go ahead to the next slide. What we could bring to this was, in our mind, the ability to collaborate with all of our area's education stakeholders. And you see there the aspirational goal of every child, every family, and every community. We recognized that this problem disproportionately affects urban youth and minority youth, but that there is a growing issue in greater Kansas City, in some of our more affluent counties, that kids are not reading at grade level and kids are not ready for kindergarten on their first day. So to that end, we've tried to be very deliberately regional and collaborative in our work. We're not just focused on urban youth. We're not just focused on kids in Kansas City, Missouri. We're focused on the entire region, and that is a unique role our chamber plays here. We're a regional chamber. There is no other regional chamber like us in this area, and that's really one of the things that we can bring to this effort. Go ahead to the next slide. We said when we launched this initiative that we would try and do three things. We call them the A, B, and C of this effort. First is assessment. We pledged that we would gather and analyze data, and we're in the process of doing that now, so that we could understand the current conditions around early childhood in our area. As you all know, if you work in this space much, assessment for early childhood education is actually very difficult and expensive to do because the children themselves can't sit and fill in bubbles on a test. It's one of the reasons. But we have pledged to try and gather data, both what exists and fill the gaps of what exists with what is missing, and then to hold ourselves accountable for the progress that's made over the course of the initiative. Second thing we said we'd do is buy-in. And you can really read that as investment, but don't read that as just dollars. The chamber knew that not only do we have companies that could write checks, we certainly have that, and I know everyone expects when chambers of commerce get into early childhood education that the money will follow, but they also have the ability to tap into large employee bases. And one of the things that we heard consistently when we did this research was we don't just need money, we need volunteers. And we were hearing from our employers that they had employees who would love to volunteer to read to kids or to be a mentor to a child. And we thought we could link those things up. So buy-in isn't just dollars. It's also blood, sweat, and tears, and time. And then the third thing there, you see collaboration. I mentioned that before. But we see ourselves as pretty neutral in terms of having a certain perspective on early childhood education. We're not a school district. We're not an early childhood education provider. We are pretty agnostic in terms of a philosophy on this, and that's an advantage to us in being a collaborator and a convener around the topic. So we've begun now our work. We launched this initiative about 7 months ago, and we've broken the work into 5 working groups. You can go ahead to the next slide. They are early education finance, parent engagement, community engagement, quality and assessment, and public policy. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. And in early education finance, we realized very quickly there's enormous cost around this. By my back of the envelope estimate, it would cost roughly $1 billion a year to educate in high-quality early childhood education programs all kids in greater Kansas City. $1 billion a year. Well, nobody has that money. The states don't have it. We're a unique community in that we sit on a state line, so we're dealing with 2 state legislatures here. But the states don't have it, and there is no either single or group of philanthropic foundations that can provide anywhere near $1 billion a year to solve this problem. So what this group has identified in its 6 months of working so far is that you're going to have to come up with a braided funding model. And that means some private dollars, probably private dollars to launch concept and put something together that can be proved as having positive outcomes. but then over the long term, you're going to have to braid some public funds in there with it. Go ahead to the next slide. The parent engagement issue in early childhood ed is perhaps the most difficult in our experience to tackle. You have adult literacy issues, negative educational experience, which is as simple as saying if you didn't do well in school, you aren't going to emphasize the importance of school to your own children. And the last bullet there that I want to point out is one that I never thought would be an issue, but it is simply jealousy. There are parents out there who simply say, well, I didn't have that kind of early childhood educational intervention, so I don't think my child needs that kind of early childhood educational intervention. So what we have to do, what this group has pledged to do, is to meet parents where they are, culturally, educationally, emotionally, and physically. And that means in some cases, actually, we're working on a program right now to bring the Dolly Parton Imagination Libraries to a certain portion of urban Kansas City, and we're going to actually go door to door and ring doorbells and offer books to kids for free. Go ahead to the next slide. So because not every kid is growing up in a dual parent household where the parents have 30 minutes to talk, read, and play with their child every day before they go to bed, you have to understand the variety of family dynamics. Single-parent households, working parent households, kinship care, state and custodial care, and you have to find other ways to engage those kids. And that's what our community engagement subcommittee is doing. They're tapping into employers. Obviously, that's through the chamber and our employee member companies, friends, neighbors, and the faith-based community actually can be a great resource in getting early childhood educational interventions to kids. People trust their faith-based institutions. They have frequent contact with their faith-based institutions, and we have found that to be an especially good way to get through this barrier of community engagement. Go ahead to the next slide. The next subcommittee is quality and assessment, and David, in his introductory remarks, said something that is very familiar, which is when you're talking about quality and when you're talking about assessment, the system is not set up for an integrated, streamlined process to get a child from an early childhood educational program fed into K-12 with seamless transition. So we have gone about the process of, instead of an assessment, which is I think what David said the LA Chamber is trying to do, simply a kindergarten screener is the way we're going. And we got some early pushback from the school district superintendents through their teachers that they didn't feel like they could spend any more time in the classroom doing assessments. And for those of you, I mentioned this earlier, but who know anything about this, assessments of children at this age are very time-consuming and very expensive. So instead, what we're developing is a set of screeners that could be given to a child within their first 2 months of kindergarten. And it would quickly assess where they are. But it could be done ideally in about 30 minutes with each child. And a true assessment, I think, is a little different than that. It's spread out over time. It's several hours. It's evaluating a child in a variety of circumstances. This really would be sit down with the teacher for about 30 minutes and get a general understanding of where they are. And we recognize that the information we'll glean from that is a bit limited. But we thought the support of the school districts and the teachers was more important than getting that drilled down data. Go ahead to the next slide. Public policy. And you can see there's a big question mark there because we don't know yet what we're going to do. We know that there is a need for funds. We know that there is a need for policy improvements. We know that there is a need, especially on our Missouri side, for some better standards around high-quality early childhood educational institutions. But we aren't far enough along yet, 6 months in. Both our states are in their legislative sessions right now, and we want to come at this fully informed. So I think it will be the 2016 legislative session for both Kansas and Missouri when we actually bring specific ideas and specific legislation to our legislatures. But I will say we have taken as a general priority item, of which there are 4 in Kansas and 4 in Missouri in our legislative agenda, that funding for early childhood education is of the highest priority to the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. Go ahead to the next slide. You can access more information about the Big Five by going to www.big5kc.com or by reaching out to me. Here is all of my contact information. And then go to the next slide. It's actually kind of an important one, as you all can appreciate. But what's important about this slide is not just that these folks help pay our salaries, but that we really do have, for those of you who are exploring the idea of getting into this space, we have broad support from some of our community's most high-profile companies to be doing this work. And without that, we couldn't do it. But I think it's affirming when you go out as a Chamber of Commerce representative and you speak to these groups. It is affirming to know that though they will admit to their ignorance about the subject, when you talk to them about it, it doesn't take long before you have real converts on your hands. So for those who are doing it or in that part of the process, I would encourage you to keep at it, because you will find that you will change people's minds when you begin to show them some of the data around this. And that's it. I'll wait and listen for questions at the end. Mila?
Well, thank you so much, Scott, and good afternoon to all who are on the call. And David, thank you for your kind introduction. Greetings from Birmingham, Alabama. As David mentioned, I am with the Birmingham Business Alliance, a relatively new organization. We were formed in 2009. We were formed as a result of a merger of 3 organizations, a Chamber of Commerce, the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, an economic development organization, and also a regional development organization. So we have a sort of a broad footprint. We serve 7 counties. Within that 7-county region, we have every imaginable configuration of community. So our education challenges, and certainly our challenges in meeting the needs of children 0 to 4, are diverse. But if you'll go to the next slide, I just want to talk through a few things about what we see as the case for pre-K funding. It was a bit of a surprise to me, candidly, coming into this role 6 years ago, to really learn that Alabama has a top-ranked pre-K program. It has been ranked one of the top 5 for several years. In fact, over the last 8 years, we have had a top-ranked program. And the reasons that it's so important have certainly been well stated by both David and Scott. We certainly know that those who graduate from high-quality pre-K programs, be they publicly funded or privately implemented, are more likely to be proficient when they are in 3rd grade in reading, and more likely to graduate from high school, and more likely to succeed in the workplace. And this is the point that I think was the central element for causing our organization to really rally around getting involved and invested in the work. We know that for every dollar invested in high-quality pre-K, we receive a return on that investment of about $7. These are things that we really began to realize resonated with the business community in terms that they could understand. And we heard just a bit earlier about how it's so important for communities of people who have common interests to speak in a language that they can all understand. And so what we saw as an organization was an opportunity to help bridge the gap between what the community said it needed and what educators said they needed and what the business community needed on the back end in terms of deliverables. So if we'll go to the next slide, we'll talk about our goals and by the numbers that we use to measure. And these are in some ways audacious because Alabama is not a wealthy state. But because we have a product that is so powerful and one that other states come to model, we think it's important to fund it in a way that values what it can do. So our goal is to increase pre-K funding to a level of $125 million by 2023. That would result in 70% of 4-year-olds in our state being enrolled in a program across a diverse spectrum. Again, funding could go through public systems, tagging onto existing K-12 systems, or it could be deployed in private systems with appropriate measurables put in place for those as well. Right now, we're showing about 12% of our eligible students enrolled in the program, so we have a ways to go. But that number has increased and doubled, in fact, since last year. So that's an important measure for us as well. Our 2012 funding was $19 million, and in 2014 that funding was increased to $38 million. So how did we go about doing it? And that's really kind of the meat of why I think I am on the call and what we want to talk through. So if we'll go to the next slide, we'll talk through some sort of strategies for building the successful campaign. I mentioned that we are a relatively new organization formed 6 years ago. We went through a strategic plan, much like the plan that Scott described. Pre-K funding, or quality pre-K education popped up in our analysis, and I think in large measure, again, because we did have a product to begin with that made sense. But what we had to do was to begin to frame the issue not just in the social needs, but also in terms of the business needs. We have always had a very generous community that looked at how to integrate and provide services to the community at large when a need needs to be met. We needed to cause those very philanthropically minded individuals to see investment in pre-K and advocacy for pre-K as a big business imperative. And what that means is we had to develop a really compelling case statement. We did that in concert with a number of agencies throughout the state because, again, our objective was to increase funding across the state. My service area is 7 counties, but we've got a whole lot of the state left that needed to have attention as well. And so it was really important not only building a coalition among the leadership here in education and nonprofit and business within this region, but reaching across the state. And we have done that through an alliance called the Alabama School Readiness Alliance, who has as a singular focus the implementation of quality pre-K across the state. This, I'll take you to the next point, is a results-oriented coalition. It's not good enough to really just talk about it. We've got to be sure that there are measurable outcomes put in place, and we've got to be sure that the people who are advocating for these outcomes are driven to succeed. So we are singularly minded about that. We also think it's important and have recognized, particularly when dealing in the political spectrum, that it's important to create opportunities for leaders to emerge and to celebrate them when they do. This is true not just of the business leaders who we've identified in our community who've really taken on the mantle of leadership in terms of advocacy, not only among their peers but also among legislators. But when you have a legislative leader, or in our case, when you have a governor who's really invested in the program, you have to tout them, you have to celebrate them, because that is very helpful when you are then going to seek the funding that you need to make the programs work. This year, this legislative session, because we too are in the throes of that, we have asked for $13.2 million. This is a number that would get us to our full investment by 2023. We are a state that is in like many states, in a bit of a financial pinch. Looking at the budget numbers that were proposed just last night, we are in the budget for $10 million. Now, that's a great victory, I think. It's certainly not all that we want, but as I say in that last bullet, half a loaf is better than no loaf at all. We live and have to work within a circumstance where the needs are many and the resources are finite. So I think as much as we can get in terms of budget appropriations, we know we're going to be in the budget. We will take that $10 million. We will use it. We will leverage it with other federal opportunities and philanthropic opportunities to make that extend as far as we can, knowing that the overall objective, the objective of getting quality pre-K funding to as many children as we can, remains the top priority. So it's really about making that case, taking it to the legislature, causing them to see the value of the outcome, and you know, it's spade work every day, but I think, as everyone has said, it's the dollar that is best spent, and we've had success in doing that. So with that, I will conclude and turn it back over, I believe, to David.
Yes. Wow. So if you have questions, I have two queued up. Type them in for me, and I'll address the questions for you. I hope you can see why we asked Scott and Mila to participate. I'm just so impressed and inspired by your work and the work of your two entities, what bright lights you are. And so I have a whole bunch of questions that I've keyed up, but I'm going to try to behave myself and start with the questions that are in the queue. So the first question, I think, is to you, Scott, which is a question around the screeners. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're creating the screening tool, or is it a screening tool or screeners themselves or some combination, and are you willing to share it with us publicly?
Yes, absolutely. So the answer to that second part of the question is yes, we will absolutely share. There are a variety of models out there. And we're fortunate in this work, as I said, to be working collaboratively. So there is a part of the University of Missouri Kansas City called the Institute for Human Development, and there a woman who is very knowledgeable about this issue is preparing a group of 3 or 4 screeners. So the vision we have right now is that we will bring 3 or 4 different varieties of screeners to several different area school districts, and we'll just try them all out. And we know that there are going to be some that are preferred over others. So instead of just saying that we think we know what's the best kind of screener, we're going to bring 3 or 4 to the different districts and then solicit feedback from the teachers and the administrators who administer the screeners, and probably from there decide on one common screener for the school years that follow. But yes, when we get to that point, I would be happy to share it with everybody.
Terrific. Thank you. And thank you to our participants. I see now a bunch of great questions that have come in. So I don't know if we'll get to all of them. If we don't, I promise them we'll try to ask our panelists, myself included, to get to the ones we can't. So let me take the next question that came in, which I think is great. And I'll maybe ask you to go first, Mila. So did you encounter some business colleagues within your chamber community or business community that were reluctant to take on early childhood education as part of your advocacy to avoid the pressure on more taxes or taking the money away from K-12 or some other educational priorities?
Sure, and just as a way of background, Alabama is one of the very few states that has 2 budgets, a separate education budget and then a general fund budget, and all of the educational opportunities throughout the state, including you know, up through university, come out of that education budget. So at some point they're just kind of all fighting against each other, and you know, it's in many senses like choosing your favorite child. But, you know, here's the thing. Not everyone is going to be an upfront champion for this issue, much as they won't be for, you know, another. And so you just need to find those within the community who are your champions, and those are the ones that you work with, and you leverage them and their relationships so that you can, you know, maximize the outcome. I think it's okay, actually, that, you know, in a perfect world, yes, everyone would be on board with this very important work. That is not the reality, not because it's not important, but just because it may not be urgent to that industry. And so recognizing that makes it okay to just focus on the champions you have and leverage them to the best of your ability.
Scott, do you want to give a quick answer to that?
Sure.
Question?
Just briefly, Mila's absolutely right. When you go out and you talk to your members about this, nobody's going to tell you they're not for early childhood education. It's like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody's for it. But the challenge is, and Mila alluded to this, it's very expensive. And that's where people will tell you you lose them. Is, hey, I'm all for it, but gosh, Scott, $1 billion a year every year forever, compounded by the rate of inflation in education, that's a lot of money. But even despite that big price tag, you will find people in your community who, especially the ones who will sit down with you and read about the return on investment, who will get it.
So I'll just add real quickly, this is David now putting on a panelist hat, taking off my facilitator hat. Same experience we've had. When we presented to the LA Chamber's Executive Committee last year a recommendation to support some legislation that would have expanded early education to the tune of about $3 billion. We have a state budget that's over $100 billion. That's still big, right? Those are huge numbers. And we made a very straightforward case. We said, you know, we're spending over $60,000 a year to incarcerate at this point in California, and we're incarcerating people at an alarming rate. We spend $8,000 or $9,000 to educate in K-12. We have solid evidence that there is a direct correlation between an infant, toddler, or preschooler preschool age that does not get quality preschool and the propensity of them to become incarcerated, to commit crimes. And we just showed that kind of evidence in 4 or 5 different ways. That wasn't the only way, but it just is a way to illustrate what my colleague said. The return is just tremendous, and the case for business people, if you can show that return, was pretty persuasive. Even my most conservative, I have another question about how do you deal with sort of the issues that divide along party lines and sort of perspectives in that regard. And I would just say that even the more conservative members of the LA Chamber's Executive Committee were really blown away by the facts. If we just showed the facts, that was our best ally. So let me go to the next question. Similar, but it's a good slice of this. So in spite of the Heckman data, a lot of business leaders see that AC is kind of a democratic platform. The Republican legislators would still view ECE as a parent's responsibility, not a community obligation. How do you suggest overcoming that myth? Great question, by the way. Thank you for the one that asked that. So Mila or Scott, which one do you want to take a whack at this one? We have other good questions, so maybe just one of you.
Well, I'll take a crack at it because I'm in a red state. Birmingham is a blue spot in a red state. But we have been floored here by, again, largely data-driven, but the Republican leadership has certainly embraced and taken on this as a platform issue. Our governor, through his office of the Department of Children's Affairs, embedded in the governor's office, leads this initiative. It is reinforced by many of the business leaders who are also particularly and heavily involved in Republican politics and leadership, you know, they get it because it's a business imperative to them. So it's reinforced. And so I am surprisingly, in a state like Alabama, if it can happen here, I believe you just have to, again, it's spade work and making the case for it.
Okay, Scott, I have another question for you. Is it okay if I move to it, or do you want to?
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
Okay. So how do you decide, Scott, on focusing on pre-K or other early childhood investments? I know we struggle with this ourselves. We were kind of naively thinking we're going to support early childhood education, 0 to 5, and all of a sudden we had to learn that there's a pre-K constituency and a pre-K issue, and there's infants and toddlers. So how did you decide to navigate that question?
Yeah, that was a difficult issue for us. There were some folks, as you said, here in our community who were pre-K advocates. The thing we heard, and we heard it most clearly, again, from our school district superintendents was, if you wait until they're 4, you will have kids who are already 3 years behind. And that if you get them in high-quality pre-K, then you'll have them in kindergarten maybe 2 years behind. But that the problem really has to be addressed almost from birth. If you really want to eliminate the contingency of kids who aren't ready or who are a year or 2 or 3 or 4 behind their peers when they start that first day of kindergarten, that if you're waiting until they're 4, you've already waited too long. One of the pieces of literature that really drove us was called The Early Catastrophe, and I mentioned it in my remarks, but it was done by some folks at the University of Kansas. This is the 30 million word gap literature. It says that by age 4, children of welfare level income have experienced 30 million fewer words than their affluent peers. And that, of course, has profound effect on both their academic abilities, but also, and maybe more interestingly, their social and emotional capabilities. So there are a number of programs, both here locally and throughout the country, about talking and reading and playing with your child before that child is able to do any of those things back. And that 30 million word gap literature really persuaded us to get into the 0 to 5 space, not just the 4 and 5-year-old space.
Okay, Mila, do you want to say anything to that, or can I go to the next question?
Feel free to go ahead.
Okay, and I'll concur the same experience we had. We used some research in addition to what Scott just mentioned that some of you have probably seen, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It was done by Hart and Risley, and Hart and Risley did the same kind of research that Scott just referenced around the word gap, and they showed in their research that between birth and 36 months old, there's an enormous gap in vocabulary between children on welfare and children from middle-class families. And that's where we started seeing the achievement gap is already established at 3 years old. And that if you wait, you're just chasing your tail all the way through high school and beyond.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful graph. And so I also recommend it because it's the kind of graph that we drop in the policy briefs for our board. And, you know, business people get graphs, and it's a really easy graph to just sort of make the case that I just described. It just blows you away. Okay, so my next question.
Let me just make one point to that, and I meant to say this in my remarks. Depicting things graphically is a very important tactic and tool. It gets the message across so quickly, I think, with people. It works not only with business leaders, it certainly works with legislators who've been hit with a lot of, text-intense documents. So if you can develop infographics, all the better.
Yeah, the Hart and Risley graph and the Heckman curve, those two are just like gold in this case making. Okay, my next question comes in as, what are the top 2 or 3 challenges you've experienced thus far? So, Mila, why don't you go first? What are your two or three top challenges?
Well, again, our challenge really has to do with the constraints that are financial in terms of the budgetary process. I think we have effectively built a coalition that stretches across the state, but we would like to achieve a good outcome, but we can't do that if we don't have funding to achieve that good outcome. And so for us, because of how our funding works and operates, and because we are in some sense, again, we're competing against the K-12 system. We're competing against the 2-year system. We're competing against the 4-year system for funding. And as an organization, we have interest in all of those systems and their funding streams. It just makes it difficult. So I think, you know, those are challenges that we seek to overcome on the other side of the hall from me by sort of driving economic development and activity that will hopefully grow the pie that we all have to cut.
Scott, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced?
So we've had several, but I'll tell you one that's really frustrating to me, and it's kindergarten readiness. What does that mean? Because when I've asked people, I get a different definition every time I talk about it. We have roughly 36 school districts in the greater Kansas City area, and each one of them has a unique understanding of kindergarten readiness. And sometimes different elementary schools within the same district have different understandings of kindergarten readiness. And sometimes different teachers within the same elementary school in that district have a different definition of kindergarten readiness. And what's a real challenge to us, and again, we're still early in our work, but that assessment piece, understanding whether or not a child is kindergarten ready, is based on sort of a common platform, right? It's to the business folks, both the chamber and the folks who drive our work, it's very simple. You're either ready for kindergarten or you're not. Well, I have looked at the standards used by a variety of school districts. Some of them are completely unachievable. So there was one, it was actually my son's district, and it said something as vague as the child can sit and start and complete a task all the way through. Well, there is no statement in that bullet point about what the task is. So if the task is, can the child write their name from beginning to end, sure, my son can do that. But if the task is, can they do a 100-piece puzzle, well, no. So where then, how is that useful in understanding whether or not a child is ready for kindergarten? Right. That's the greatest frustration I have in our work so far. And I know there are other chambers out there who have dealt with the same frustration and have had some success breaking through it. And I hope that we'll do the same.
That's great. And I say related to that, our own experience has been we're strongly supporting Common Core. And whether you support that or you support some other K-12 standard framework, then we learned that there's no articulation between 0 to 5 and K to 12, just like you'd expect some kind of articulation K to 12 in higher ed or community college with four-year university. And so when we learned about QRIS, the whole movement to improve quality rating improvement systems for 0 to 5, we thought that it would be sort of a no-brainer that K to 12 folks would sit at the table with them and say, how do our QRIS efforts align to our Common Core or our K to 12 standards? And I guess shouldn't have been surprised, but they just talked right past each other. No one even knew what we were talking about, or that there were very few people that even paid attention and cared about it, which gets to your point about the misalignment and an unevenness of what is kinder readiness. So then a similar question. So I'll see if either of you want to do it or you feel like you've kind of answered it, but what would you do differently if you look back about how you built your foundation for the framework of doing this work? And now you look back, what would you have done differently?
I'll start, and then I'll let Mila jump in after I'm finished. I would have gone into it understanding that this is a minefield. This subject for chambers of commerce is a minefield. And no matter how hard you try, and we certainly tried really hard, you're going to step on a landmine or two. And when you do, don't be discouraged. We got in a direction, and we thought we had the support of everyone behind us, and then we got in front of a group, and they said, you can't do that, and here's why. And the rationale behind it wasn't great, but it was so important that we have that group with us that we couldn't proceed without them. And that was the big landmine we stepped on. You're going to step on landmines as you get into the field of education. There's all kinds of hidden motives in politics that you just won't see. Don't let that dissuade you from getting into the work, though.
Myla, do you have just a quick answer? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's acknowledging just how emotional this is for the people that you deal with. I mean, you know, and everyone has an experience to the point that Scott made earlier. Your experience with education informs how you approach the work. Many people have a hard time dealing with the reality is these are dollars that are invested and you won't know the outcome for another 18 years, and we are a culture that has moved rapidly towards immediate response to everything, and so it's hard for it's sometimes hard for people to have the patience to see that this makes sense. It's just too long of an arc sometimes, and so you just will run up against that, and you just have to kind of power through.
Okay, I think I didn't get to one question. Maybe we'll pose it to our panelists offline. So I apologize to our participant that asked that great question. And thank you to, first of all, both of our panelists. If we could do a virtual clap, I know our participants would give you a big shout out. And thank you to all of you that participated today in this webinar. I would have ended with one final question, which is workforce development. How do we build the professionals for the future? But let's save that for another webinar. And Jesse, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, David, and to all of our participants. It is 4 o'clock, and I know that there are some unanswered questions. We'll be following up with everyone that signed up and was able to join us as well with some follow-up to some of the questions that we didn't get to, as well as links to all of the great work in Los Angeles, Birmingham, and Kansas City. For additional resources, we have an early education Chamberpedia page that we've newly revamped with initiatives like the KC Chambers video launch of their PreK initiative and other great resources as well. So please visit those pages, as well as some our policy, early education policy page for some statements, examples as well. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.